We'll just get started in a minute. Okay, hey everyone. Was just getting my screen set up and figuring out how to use Hopin, but I think we can get started now. So I'm Archana. Thanks so much for coming to this session. I'm super happy to be here and always just excited to be in communities with other technologists interested in social good and especially in issues of inequality because they're just super important and there's a lot of work to be done in this area. I'm really excited to see this community continue to grow as well. Um, so today I'm the track lead for inequality, but I really want to focus on injustice, which I think is a broader way of looking at different inequalities. And I think it's important to have a frame of justice when we're approaching building technological tools or products to help reduce different inequalities. So today I want to use this session to give you all a good sense of the overall issue of injustice and how to develop your own justice-oriented framework, as well as just give you all a good starting toolkit and framework for developing technology for social impact with our imperfect world and all of its injustices in mind. I know you all have the skills necessary to make a meaningful difference in this space, but it's really important to know how you can actually be most helpful and avoid harmful byproducts of your work or your approach. Whether or not you actually end up going on to work at a social good-minded company or nonprofit in the future, all technologists have to understand how the work that we do actually impacts the world we live in. Tech enables us to make a lot of impact, an outsized impact really on the world. And that's what makes it such a powerful tool for trying to resolve some of these social inequalities. But it also means that we have to make sure that it's an impact we can really stand by and that actually makes the world a better place for everyone. So I'm going to talk a bunch about trying to develop this framework, as well as a little bit about my own journey from Duke to Color of Change, which is the racial justice nonprofit that I am currently working at. Um, so first, I have a check-in question. I thought it would be nice to start with just understanding what you all are working on at this hackathon, or broadly, what issues in injustice and inequalities matter most to you. So if you could just go ahead and put that in the chat, would love to see that. Are you all able to put things in the chat? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Who just joined, where we're just answering this check-in question of what injustice or inequality your hack is addressing, or what just matters most to you. Cool. So feel free to continue to put that in the chat. I really enjoy just seeing what other people are interested in and working on. And hopefully this presentation will provide you with some good questions to continue to ask yourself, or some other things to explore after this. So as I said, I'm Archana. I am originally from New Jersey, and I graduated from Duke in 2019. I majored in computer science and political science. Through my 4 years at Duke, I slowly discovered that I really wanted to be at the intersection of technology, social change, and politics. And I actually didn't explore or discover CS until college. I randomly took CS 101 my first year at Duke, and just really liked the problem solving aspect of it, and especially the fact that you can use technology and use computer science to solve problems in a lot of different areas. So while I was at Duke, I was able to explore a lot of both of these interests as well as this intersection, and did a bunch of research projects here. I was able to work on an algorithmic redistricting project, as well as an automated fact-checking project with PolitiFact fact checkers, and that was really cool. I also am really interested in more like the political science side of things, and understanding theory, and understanding from a more like theoretical perspective how technology is impacting our culture and our society. And so I was able to teach a half-credit class at Duke about this, and that was also a really fun experience. So through a lot of my experiences at Duke, I was able to figure out what I was really interested in, but I knew that full-time experience was going to be really different, and would help give me some of those foundational technical skills, and help me figure out like where exactly I want to be in this area. So for my first year out of college, I worked at Microsoft. I was a software engineer from last August to this past October, and I worked on this call center data analytics service. I'd never interned at Microsoft before, so I was placed pretty randomly on a team, but I had a pretty good experience, and was definitely able to, I think, build a pretty good technical foundation for myself. And then a few months ago in October, I joined Color of Change as their third founding software engineer. And so currently I'm in the process of figuring out how we're going to build the team up, and how we can best serve the organization and its goals, as well as the broader movement technology ecosystem. And so for those of you who don't know, Color of Change is a big racial justice nonprofit, and it's focused on activating people and campaigning digitally. So there's a lot of potential here for just creating different technical products that can help run campaigns better, whether that's political campaigns, or policy, or just community change oriented campaigns. So I'm really excited to be at Color of Change, and I am glad that in the past couple of years, I've been able to develop my own framework and understanding of where I can be in this space, and how I can use my technical skills, social good and social change. And so this is kind of what I want to share today, is just different aspects of how I developed my own framework for this. So first, I'm just going to go into some of the basic factors that just inform my perspective. Before getting into it, my overall perspective on social justice and change comes a lot from organizing. When I moved to Seattle, I made it a priority to get involved in different organizing groups, to really understand how grassroots change happens and how people mobilize in that way. And I think that has been a really powerful experience. So I encourage those of you who are interested in making a difference through technology to also identify opportunities to get involved with different organizing groups on the side. I want to highlight the third bullet here because I think sometimes people can get tripped up with this. Sometimes thinking about inequality or injustice in the world can feel really overwhelming. And if your day job or while you're in school, you feel like you're unable to do something that helps out, I just want to make it clear that there's always something you can do from where you are. Sometimes that's hard to figure out, and sometimes it's just your time or financial resources if you're able to. But there are always different things that you can do on the side, and I just push you all to identify those both while you're a student, like through things like Hackduke, as well as when you're full time. Um, So here I just pulled out a bunch of different news headlines and graphics from a bunch of different reports and newspapers. And here I want to emphasize that there are so many different types of inequality, and it's crucial to understand how many of them overlap and intersect with each other. Um, I also want to underscore that the issue of inequality can't be an afterthought. It's not something that can be compartmentalized as like its own issue. Um, so as an example, if you are working on a health related hack for like the health track of this hackathon, you should also understand how different types of inequality, for example, race and class can impact the quality of healthcare or education or access to these things and variety. And so I think inequality is really a lens through which you should look at all of these different issues. And it's not something that can be solved on its own in isolation from all these other issues. So going along with this, when you're building up your foundational knowledge in this area, I think it's also really important to have an intersectional perspective in to figure out how different people are actually impacted by an issue based on their different identities. So if you're not familiar with the term, I think this picture does a pretty good job of laying it out. But basically, it's this concept that indicates that people have a lot of different identity factors and lived experiences, and they all impact each person at the same time. So this means that you can't take one identity marker and think that you automatically know what this means for a particular person. And it's important to see how some of these different identity markers are also interconnected with each other. So for example, I took two different headlines and put them here as well. I'll just focus on the first one, so the US has the worst maternal mortality rate amongst developed countries in the world, but Black mothers especially have the worst rate. It's 3 times the average. Which is really, really bad. And so when you're analyzing this, and if you're thinking about if you happen to be working on a health hack and, for example, you are trying to address the maternal mortality rate, then when you're analyzing this problem, you should be able to see that there's something about the US healthcare system that makes it so that women have these negative outcomes overall, but there's something on top of that that makes it even worse for Black women. And so if you are creating a hack in this area, or you're creating a startup or working in this area, then it's important to understand all of these different factors, how all of these different identity factors impact what you're doing and impact health. Um, and and just as a cautionary note, if you are ever in an environment where it seems like someone is saying like, we are just taking the neutral approach here. There's no neutral approach. And usually when people say that in cases where they're trying to address some type of injustice or inequality, they actually typically mean white, male, heterosexual, American, English speaking, et cetera, et cetera. And you kind of get the point from there. So now that we are equipped with some of these fundamentals, we can go into seeing what we can do when we are outraged by some injustice and want to do something but are not sure what. So this slide, the content on this slide is from Miriam Kaba, who is a pretty well-known abolitionist, and activist, and educator. And she has this list of questions that you can ask yourself when you find yourself really passionate about some inequality or injustice and want to figure out what to do. Um, I think it's important to highlight these two questions because, especially because they are often overlooked. In the tech world, there can be a sense of techno-utopianism, or like excessive thinking that tech is the solution and like we can just build an app to eliminate racism or something. And this can be a really dangerous attitude to have. And so I encourage you, when you are thinking about doing something in this area, you should spend a lot of time trying to educate yourself on what is actually happening in the area, on research, what work people are doing, what think tanks, what policymakers, what nonprofits are saying and doing in this area, and what tactics are working and what are not. And in addition to that, if you do want to work with these people and collaborate with people who have already been doing the work for a long time, it's important to make sure you're asking questions and listening with a lot of respect. Because that is also another problem that happens in the tech world when people in tech really want to try to help out with some issues. Sometimes there's like a weird power dynamic, and it can feel like from the other side, activists or policymakers or people on the non-tech side of things are not respected as much. And we are all equal partners in this work. Okay. So as you're thinking about some inequality or particular injustice that you really care about, you should start also thinking about what your theory of change is. Chances are you already have a theory of change that you've developed, but you just haven't articulated it that way. At its core, it's simply a methodology used to understand what the process is for enacting some sort of social change or just pushing the lever on some social issue. And so here it's important to understand the overall ecosystem and what players, what incentives, and what mechanisms there are that affect whatever inequality or injustice you care a lot about. And so here I just listed out some key questions that I think can help figure out and help you build out your theory of change so that you can ultimately determine the fourth question, which is what is the most effective thing that I can do? And how will that work? How will that move things forward? The second question I also want to emphasize, because this is something that I think, again, tech people tend to run past, because sometimes we can think like, we know what the nature of the problem is. We know how things work. But I want to give an example of somewhere where it is really important to really figure out what makes the problem problematic and why does it still exist and why does it persist. So imagine, and this is not exactly an inequality, but for some people, this might be a perceived injustice. So for example, imagine that you are really concerned with data collection by big corporations and or government. If you think that this is problematic because individuals don't have control of their data and of who has it, then you might think that the solution to that is simply to lay out regulation or make it so that companies allow customers or consumers to request that their data be deleted. But if you go back and you think that the problem of data collection is not just that, but also perhaps that certain big companies have a monopoly on this data and are able to construct environments that nudge people to make certain decisions, then that means your solution is inherently going to be different from the one that we came up with before. And so before you're acting, it's important to figure out what the nature of the problem really is and why it is problematic for you so that you can figure out the best solution for it. And something I do want to emphasize as well, bringing in bullet number 3, is just that sometimes we will be wrong. Sometimes our theory of change will be wrong. And it's important that this is an iterative process. So you're always learning as you test out your theory of change. Maybe you thought something was going to make a difference and it didn't quite make as much of a difference as you thought, or it didn't move the needle, or the mechanism just that you had in mind just didn't work. In that case, it's okay, but it's time to amend your theory of change and see what assumptions you had made that were wrong, or maybe a little bit misdirected or something. For the fourth question, what are the most effective tools and strategies you can use to push for social change? Here, another thing to emphasize is that sometimes often the solution will not be technology. It will not be a technological tool. And it is essential as a technologist to understand when that's the case. So in my own work, if you're a software engineer or if you're on a tech team or something, you want to be able to do good work. You want to be able to come up with cool products that help solve problems. A really important quality of someone in this space, of a software engineer in this space, is the ability to distinguish between situations where the technology is really crucial and can move us forward, and where it's just dead weight, and it's simply something that takes too much time, and it would have been more effective to do something else. And this is an important skill to start practicing, and make sure you know if you do end up going into this area. So Miriam Kaba's second two questions are going into what you can do. And with your skills, in this case, we're talking specifically about building some type of technological tool. How can you be constructive, and what can you do after you've built out your theory of change? So we can now try to figure out how has tech supported, ignored, or impaired fights for justice? In this next section, I'm gonna use a couple of pieces of information from Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology. It's a really, really great book, and obviously it focuses on the relationship between race and technology, but I think it's pretty applicable for all types of social injustices and tech, and would definitely highly recommend. And I put it in the resources section of this PowerPoint, so you can check it out later. So in this book, Ruha Benjamin defines the new Jim Code, which again can be applied to different types of social injustices. And she defines this as the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. And so one example and a way to apply this definition to another social issue, imagine we are concerned with inequality of opportunity in employment. A lot of this inequality we know comes from the recruiting process. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that applicants with similar resumes and similar experience will be rejected at different rates depending on, for example, how ethnic a name sounds or how feminine coded a name is. And so one solution that people might come up with is, let's create an automated filtering system for resumes powered by AI. And maybe this will help reduce some gender and racial bias that comes from humans subconsciously or consciously. And again, it's important to emphasize that often these types of solutions people who will sell these types of solutions will say, because this is an AI-powered tool and we've taken humans out of the loop, this is simply more objective and meritocratic, and there's just no potential for bias. And this is a really dangerous perspective to have. So some of you are probably aware of this, but Amazon actually tried this out. They had an automated filtering tool that they used, and they quickly rolled it back because they realized that the tool was biased against women. And the reason for this, as they said, was because they had trained their tool on data on previous successful engineering applicants. And so because of the nature of the tech industry and the current demographics of it, there are just fewer women in engineering roles. And so what this algorithm essentially was doing is penalizing those who had feminine coded names, as well as activities like a women in tech group on their resume. Um, and so this is an interesting example because it shows exactly what this definition is trying to talk about. And I think two important points here are that when we use technology in this way, often it can simply reproduce the inequality, but it can be even more dangerous because this technology further obscures how the bias comes into play and how it works. And there's also a lack of accountability. Because these algorithms are often black boxed and it's harder to say and communicate to people what exactly is happening and how decisions are actually made. And then because all of these decisions are made by an algorithm, it's also difficult to say who should be accountable for this and how do we actually mandate that, and then what do we do after. So I think that's a pretty powerful example and interesting that Amazon tried it out. So next, I want to go through a couple of different examples of technologies or technological tools that people have created that either reproduce certain social norms or inequalities, or ignore them, thus reproducing them, or try to help, but do it in a slightly flawed way. So in this example, so first going over this sentence, engineered inequity to, so as we're characterizing this, basically, if you build something that doesn't take into account existing relationships and power structures in the environment that you're trying to intervene in, then you risk potentially increasing the disparity in power between two different groups or multiple groups in this environment. And this is especially true in cases when a particular technology helps one player or one side of the equation use their power more or just more efficiently. So as an example, this picture is from a Washington Post article about test monitoring and proctoring technologies that seem to have become really popular in the last year. And there's been a lot of student protest against these types of technologies. And I hope not a lot of you have had to experience that because they do not seem great. But so basically, there's been a lot of protest against them because they seem pretty harmful for students and their learning processes, and don't take into account the fact that students just have different types of learning processes and live in different types of environments in this COVID world right now. And they also tend to increase the level of stress of students because students are constantly being surveilled and policed in their own home when they're just trying to go to school and get an education and take a test. And there's also this kind of implicit assumption that students will end up cheating, and you just have to be vigilant and constantly watch students to help catch that. So obviously here, there is a power differential between students and professors, and heightening that disparity by building what is in effect a surveillance technology tool, does not seem likely or proven to create a safe educational environment for everyone. And so this is an example of where a better analysis of the different players in this environment and a better understanding of literature in the area of like how do students learn best and how do you create good, safe educational environments would have helped create a better technology to help students pay attention and avoid cheating at home. Next, we have a category of default discrimination, which is basically addressing products and tools that try to offer people better ways of managing some sort of social problem by making predictions so that groups or people can take action on those predictions and resolve the problem before it happens. So some examples are kind of like predicting those who are more likely to drop out of high school or develop some disorder or more likely to commit a crime, etc. And sometimes these types of predictions can definitely be done safely, but you just have to take caution and make sure you know exactly what you're measuring and how what you're measuring is impacted by social factors. So in the two examples I used here, they're both related to predictive policing, which has grown in popularity in the last few decades, and can often seem pretty scary. So they are often created by people who, want to make it easier, who are concerned with crime and want to make it easier to manage crime, by predicting who is more likely to commit a crime or what areas are more likely to have criminal activities conducted in, etc. And so this predpol tool essentially gives a way for police officers to figure out, mathematically, what crime zones there are, and in effect, those become places where these police officers go and monitor more heavily, and surveil more heavily. And so what actually happens with these types of technologies is they tend to mislabel Black people as being more likely to commit a crime, and also they also lead to more heavily surveilled Black communities and neighborhoods. And I really like the way that Ruha Benjamin framed this, by talking about how these are not so much as crime prediction tools, but crime production tools, because there has to be an understanding that crime in our current society is something that is socially defined, and and so depending on where you send people, if you send people to certain neighborhoods more, then naturally there will tend to be more crime there. And there's also a point that so that's like one aspect of this, that makes these technologies problematic, and makes them just simply reproduce existing inequalities, of heavily policing Black people and Black communities. And then the second is just that there has to be an understanding that in many data sets related to people, and social relationships, there's going to be bias, especially because these are based on historical data. And if we have had racist policing, in the past, then we should expect to have, a data set that is biased in that direction. And it's important to be able to recognize that, before trying to create something like this. So next, here is an example of technologies that aim to do some good, to help, reduce some type of inequality, but may end up, just exacerbating, inequalities. And through this slide, I really want to point out the broader infrastructure of society and why it's important to have a theory of power, which means like who has power, how do they maintain power, how do people challenge that power or resist? And it's similar to theory of change, but it's just slightly different. I think it's important to also like have a sense of that and develop that for yourself. So in this example, I'm going to use facial recognition as the example. The MIT Media Lab a couple of years ago came out with this really monumental report on, commercial facial recognition tools, and basically exposed that most of these tools are not able to recognize darker skinned folks, and especially darker skinned women. And this report ended up being really monumental and pivotal because it led to a lot of research into how we can better these facial recognition technologies, and allow them to recognize everyone equally, to just make sure that everyone is able to be inputted into these, different tools and recognized. And so at one level, you might think that this is a good idea and this is a valiant effort, and we should make sure that all people are included in these types of technologies, especially because something like facial recognition is used for a lot of humanitarian efforts, helping out with human trafficking or putting families back together. Um, and also facial recognition is obviously used in some of our commonplace devices like the iPhone Face ID, and we want everyone to be able to use these things equally. But it's also important if you're working in this area to understand how these technologies are actually used in the real world. And so with facial recognition, one of the big emerging and expanding uses is for police departments, is for immigration services, DHS, et cetera. And this is a case where a lot of times, if you look into how these different entities actually gain access to these facial recognition tools, it tends to be through sketchy means. And in effect, these technologies end up allowing these types of departments and organizations to accumulate power over governance that they have not received through the democratic process. And so this is just showing an example of a way that technology can kind of harmfully impact our democracy. And that it's important here to also recognize that this is not a technical problem. It's a political one, but it's one that we need to be aware of as technologists. And you can't just focus on the technology at hand. So a lot I said in this presentation so far is meant to really make you more critical of your role as a technologist in the social good space, and make sure you're questioning what you're doing and how you can be most effective in this space. But there are also a lot of really, really great, inspiring projects out there where people are really figuring out how they can use data and technology to fight for a more just world while collaborating with the organizations and the people who have been doing the work for a very long time. So I just put a bunch of examples of different organizations that inspire me and that seem really cool. And I would definitely encourage you all to check some of these out. Justice Text, Open Field, and Propel are startups, and they're all kind of all over the place, trying to target criminal justice issues, or political activism and campaigning, or income inequality, and then there are also different organizations that are kind of more think tanks. So like Data for Black Lives is a research and kind of think tank organization that produces a lot of interesting resources and reports. And then the Database for Police Abolition, if that's something you're interested in, is just a project that was created by random people who met on Twitter because they were interested in figuring out how they can do a project to help out with this. So it's kind of a lot of different examples, ranging from a more like technological startup to like a research-based organization and a kind of like random side project that people can do, which I think is pretty cool. Takeaways, I hope you are coming away with a better idea of how to use your skills, your technical skills for social good, and also with maybe a renewed energy around getting involved in these issues beyond the technical. I really encourage you to get involved with different organizing groups where you are, especially during this time of COVID. There's a lot of organizing going on, and there's a lot of help that people need. And this is a great time to just get involved and learn how that works, learn how to mobilize with people, because that will absolutely make you a better software engineer in this area. Also, I do want to mention that there's a whole spectrum of work that you can do in this area, and it ranges from the very technical to maybe understanding, what are notions of fairness in AI development, and like how does that work, to the more policy-oriented, just like how do we create better technology policy. And there is a whole lot in between there. So there's so much to explore. So just, keep that in mind as you think about what you want to do after college and in your career, because there are so many options and a lot of them are pretty undefined still, and you can define them for yourselves. So I have a couple more resources here. If you're interested in finding different internships or full-time jobs in this area. A lot of these tech for social good communities you kind of just fall into randomly, but they're all really great. And I would encourage you to just check all these out if you're interested. Coding It Forward, I know, has a really cool internship, like a fellowship. And it seems like pretty great opportunity. And Blue Bonnet is an organization that runs data and tech part-time fellowships, which you can do if you're full-time as well, or like as a student. And you're essentially placed on down ballot campaigns, and you're able to help these campaigns use different technologies, movement technology tools to help win their campaigns. And it's a really cool organization. Um, yeah, so if anyone, I can open it up to questions. If anyone has questions to put in the chat, or I think you can also add yourself as a moderator. And yes, I have this link that I will send in the chat. Yeah, so if anyone has questions, feel free to put that in the chat or I think you can add yourself as a question asker or something. So the question is, what's your favorite part about color change, especially compared to a big tech company like Microsoft? There is so much. So I think one big thing is just that there's such a steep learning curve going from a big tech company like Microsoft that's focused on technology, obviously, and going from there to Color of Change, which is a pretty small nonprofit that is obviously non-tech focused. And there's just a lot to learn. I think my favorite part is just being surrounded by other people in the data and tech world who are also super interested and passionate about same issues I am. And everyone is just like really concerned with the overall goal of racial justice and how we can use our skills for that purpose. And it's just amazing being in such a value aligned environment. It feels like a very natural place for me to be at. Are any other questions? Drop them in the chat. Otherwise, there are also, one second, reading this question. Favorite tech for good companies? I don't think I have a favorite. I think there are some really cool startups that are working in this area. One of them is like the Propel one that I put on the slide. And then there's another one called Recidiviz that seems pretty cool. I think it's like pretty new. And it just seems like there's a lot of momentum in this area, like starting different and social good focused tech companies. But I don't think I have a favorite yet. It's more like I think people can do individually good work at some of these companies, but it often seems like an uphill battle to get that to happen. But I think more people are doing it. And then what do you think of companies like Tesla that aim to help the world through less direct means, like through accelerating electric car adoption? I think that's definitely super important. Um, um, yeah, and it seems like especially in if you are really care about like environmental issues, then there it seems like there are a lot of really innovative companies doing work in that area, and that seems really important. I am definitely someone who's a little suspicious of Elon Musk though, so that is my hesitation. Yeah. Um, Outside of career slash jobs, are there things that we can do as students to get involved with creating social change, especially in the area of inequality? Um, is this also outside? I guess I'll answer like if you want to, if you're talking about like outside of career slash jobs, but also through technical skills, and then also outside of that. With technical skills, I think I mean, there are like so many different projects that you can try on and like help out with on the side. Um, sorry. Yeah, that you can help out with on the side, and like you can create a lot of like small projects that maybe help your like local city government figure something out or resolve a problem. And in this case, like especially with things like city governments or like townships, they don't have a lot of resources, and so if you do, want to just see what's going on in where you live, and see what problems there are and see how you can help with them with like small technological fixes. That can be super helpful. I think outside of like technical skills, just getting involved with like organizing groups and activist groups is really important. I think that is where a lot of change happens. And if you do really care about inequality, you have to care about the overarching environment that we live in because all of that impacts inequality. And a lot of these organizing groups, the organizing that people do over the course of years and decades really helps set the stage for changes to come later. And so they're like really fundamental for at least my like theory of change. And so I think it's important to like be able to support them. And when you are involved in these types of organizations, you get a good sense of how they work and how decisions are made, how campaigns are run. And I'm talking more about like local campaigns, so like based on like trying to get something to happen in your local community. And once you have a good idea of that, I think you just become a better software engineer in this area because you understand how to collaborate with people who are working in a more like policy or like injustice related area where there's a pretty crazy lack of resources. And you'll just like inherently understand that. What's the project you've made for social good that you're most proud of? Um, I I think the automated fact checking project that I worked on at Duke with PolitiFact fact checkers was really cool, and I think I definitely just learned a lot from that experience. It basically we were just working with PolitiFact fact checkers to allow them to go through the fact checking process faster and more efficiently, and it was a really great opportunity to figure out like how do you actually do design in that area, like when you're working with people more on like the politics or journalism side of things, um, and just the importance of like listening to those users to figure out what they actually need and like what's actually most effective. um, and obviously fact checking and like fake news is a super big issue, so it was cool to see how I could help make a difference in that area. So also this slide has just a couple of good resources, just like a random collection of things, definitely non-exhaustive. I do want to point out Tech Workers Coalition. It is a pretty cool decentralized group of tech workers who just want to try to get their tech companies or tech companies in general to be more accountable for their actions, and like, for example, deals that they do, as well as ethics and tech stuff. And it's a good group to be a part of. They have really cool conversations. You can also meet people who are interested in social justice issues as well. And it's a good place to kind of go to collaborate with different people and figure out what different people are thinking. Um, yeah. if there are no other questions, I can just end this. If Sam, you want to say something?
Hey, yeah. I think if there are no other questions, we could probably just end this. But thank you so much, Archana. That was a really interesting talk and Q&A session. So really appreciate it. We'll also have this recorded and stuff. So post this on YouTube afterward. And we can send a link out to all the hackers. But yeah, thank you so much again. Really appreciate it.
So much for having me, and good luck everyone with your hacks. And feel free to reach out to talk about anything in this area. I'm always happy to talk to people because there's so much stuff to do.
Thank you. Bye.